Test. Test 1, 2. Test. Test 1, 2. Test, test.
Hello everybody.
Test 1, 2.
Good evening. Please take your seats. Hello everybody. I would like to welcome you to this 4th edition of the School of Democracy. On behalf of our president, Udo Bullmann, he's not here, but he will show up in a few minutes with a video. I'm Javier Moreno Sanchez. I'm the Secretary General of the group. And it's a pleasure for me. I feel younger when I'm in front of you. I'm a little bit old, but it's good that you are here because we need fresh ideas, fresh suggestions. I've been told that you are 111 young people coming from the whole European Union, but also outside the European Union. And I would like to ask you to put your headphones, please, everybody. I will explain you why. There are several reasons. First of all, because I would like to give the floor to our interpreters, because they are in conflict with the top management of the administration of the European Parliament. They are fighting for their working conditions, and it's normal, and I think it's very important that they will give you the message. So please, the interpreters.
The interpreters need to inform you that a labour dispute giving rise to a strike warning is ongoing with EP management concerning their imposed working conditions. Nevertheless, this meeting will not be affected by industrial action. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, our group is in favor of the social dialogue, and we hope that this conflict will be ended as soon as possible. But keep your headphones, because as you know, we are in Europe, diversity, multicultural societies, so it's important that you can speak in Dutch, in German, English, French, Italian, or Spanish. Please use the language, because I think it's important that everybody can speak in those languages. Everybody can speak in English, and I'm a professional to destroy the mother tongue of Shakespeare, but please speak in other language. Also because if we want that they ended the conflict with the top management, the interpreters have to work, and if we don't use them, they don't work, and there are no more conflict, but there are no more work, so please. I would like to apologize our president, Udo Bullmann. He has to be here, but he has an important meeting in Berlin, and he has to, at last minute, to cancel. But he will be with us. Fraser, can we send the video?
Dear friends, unfortunately I cannot be with you in this year's School of Democracy. I rather would wish to be there, but I have to work in Brussels and prepare the Strasbourg League, so apologies. But we have to speak this work, and we have today discussed about the ongoings in Italy, Slovenia,
Thank you. I can assure you that in reality it's better than that. Adesso siamo in Italia, devo
We're in Italy, so I should speak a bit of Italian. I want to thank all of my colleagues. For 4 years now, they've been ensuring that this event can take place in this fantastic city, and they ensure that it's a complete success. I hope the Mayor, Luca Vecchi, will be with us. I want to thank him and the municipality of Reggio Emilia too. I also would like to thank the President and the Cervi Institute and their staff. You know, tomorrow evening we will go there. The Cervi Institute is a symbol of the fight, the resistance against fascism. 7 brothers were killed, and tomorrow we will hear all about the history of that. It's very moving. All of our colleagues in the university who have been working for many days to ensure that this event is a success, I want to thank them too. And given that I'm Spanish, well, I'm going to speak Spanish. So what is School of Democracy? This is an idea, a project that was born in our political group. It's the second most important in the European Parliament, and it was pushed forward by former President Gianni Pittella, who will be with us tomorrow. In this project, the protagonists are you. You, for 3 days of intense debate, will bring forward your ideas, pose questions, and give your vision. And we will speak too. There will be politicians and members of parliament present, as well as academic staff. We have a professor with us here today. And what's this edition devoted to? Well, I would say democracy and our planet. The state of health of democracy is in danger in Europe and worldwide. We're going to talk about how we can ensure living in peace between citizens in our countries in the European Union. Migrants, citizens, rich, poor, men, women, all of them. And it's not easy. We're also going to talk about the rule of law, which is violated in various countries, Poland and Hungary, for instance. It's also called into question by some powers and some people who feel that because they have a parliamentary majority, they can just override the constitution and create an independent republic in Catalonia, violating the constitution, obviously. We're also going to talk about corruption, which endangers societies. Thankfully, we can beat corruption from time to time. This weekend, a motion of censorship was successful in Spain, and we managed to get a party out that was governing using corruption. This is all a breeding ground for many parties, populists, people who are xenophobic and racist, and people who endanger our democracy, our planet. I think you, young people, are the best to recall, to remind us of how we cannot end our planet. That's why we need a social economic development model so that we can have sustainable societies. And our group is working really hard on that. We need to look at climate change, how we can ensure an energy transition to renewables, and that will occur with individual behavior and attitudes. My oldest daughter is always saying to me, turn off the lights, turn off your tap, but that's not enough. It's not enough that individuals do this in society. It's important that politicians and people who are responsible are aware of this. I can now greet the Mayor, Luca Vecchi, who is here with us. I've already thanked everyone, Luca, but I want to repeat it. Another year. This is our 4th year. You've been really kind, and Reggio Emilia has always been extremely hospitable, and there are very few places like it in the world. So I was saying, we must govern, and the progressive parties must govern. And I'm sure you'll talk about this in the workshops. Our political family is not experiencing its best state of health at the moment. Just look at France, Hungary, Italy. In recent times, our political luck has been failing, but we should be optimistic. And the other day I said in our federal committee that we need to look at the reconquest, starting with Spain and Portugal. So I think we need to go to Europe and carry out our policies there. That's why we need to win elections. There's no other way. We must win elections. In 2019, the European Parliament elections will take place. There are also regional, national elections taking place in other countries. That's very soon. So what should we do? I think we need to believe in ourselves, first and foremost. We need to get back out into the streets and speak to people. I'm not just talking about physical roads or streets. I'm talking about the virtual streets also, because a lot takes place on social networks nowadays. We need to get on social networks if we want to understand what people want and to provide answers to them. We also need to change our narrative. This has been imposed by the right and by people who are xenophobic and racist. Allow me to give an example. For them, migration is a problem. For us, it's a challenge and an opportunity. And we must ensure that all citizens hear that message. We also need to change the European agenda, which is really being defined by the right. That means that we should not be afraid of talking about delicate issues. Our political family finds it difficult to talk about terrorism, migration, and even trade. Allow me to give you an example. Before the Socialist Group the other day, we had the former Austrian Chancellor, Christian Kroll, and they had the best results. They were head of the government, but there was a coalition. And he said to us just during the campaign, he didn't talk about migration, and that was an error because people didn't really know what the stance of the Social Democrats was as a result. So I think we always need to speak with a clear voice on all issues. And speaking clearly to people is important. I sometimes have to tell my mother what I'm doing. I have to ensure that she understands. I can't start using words that people don't understand, like six-pack or MFF, typical language of Brussels. Normal people just don't understand that kind of language. Inequality, then. This is the root of all of our ills. Inequality. In Spain, for instance, many families were evicted from their homes because they couldn't pay their mortgage or their rent. At the same time, banks who kept the houses were playing financial casino, and we had to pay all this back with public money. Injustice, when we see multinationals earning millions and millions and not paying a cent of taxes. We also need to fight against Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, the GAFAs. Then there's another very important psychological aspect that needs to be looked at. Fear. People are often afraid in our countries, and populists and extremists have understood that, and they play on that fear. One example is migration. They talk about invasion and terrorists. They say that they're coming here to eat our citizens' bread, to weigh on our public services like health and education. They say that they're in competition with the poorest citizens. We need to develop a narrative and explain to people that that is not the case. But first of all, we need to speak the truth. And the truth is that this phenomenon is not going to stop. Looking at the situation as it stands around the EU and other countries, this phenomenon is only going to grow, and people must understand that. It won't stop, and the people who are coming will stay, and that's why we have to integrate them from the very outset. So the question we must pose is, do we want to continue to leave the management of migration flows in the hands of traffickers, or will we politicians take responsibility for it? Then we need to put ourselves in the shoes of women. They feel mistreated, harassed, and even though they do the same work as men, they earn much less. And we can only achieve justice in that regard when men commit themselves. I'm going to talk about Pedro Sanchez. He's currently forming his government. It's going to be an equal government in terms of sex. So he has put some women in the most important portfolio and ministries of his government. Then, young people, you. What do you want? You want to work, you want to have fun, you want to have leisure time, education, you want to be able to travel. Many of you might not have that opportunity, and that's why we need to work for that. In order to do that, the progressive political family must get its hands dirty. We all need to get to work with organizations, with the European Socialist Organization, with the Foundation, with unions, with the Committee of the Regions. The former president of Chile, Ricardo Lagos, once said before Parliament something that we should keep in mind. The majority of world challenges have local solutions, and migration is one of them, and we should think about that. That's why we all need to work together. We must acknowledge the fact that our family is good at criticizing itself. And I think that first and foremost we need to believe in ourselves. We need to bring new ideas, and that's why we've brought you here, because you bring new ideas. I'm not going to go on and on here. It was up to me to open the session this evening.
To give the floor to our eminent professor, Paul Collier. It's a pleasure, Paul, to have you back here. You were with us in this big event we had last year, together event in Brussels. It was amazing. It was very big. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, Paul. I think that Luca has to leave, so he will. Sí, va bene. Sorry, Paul. Luca, te doy la palabra.
Luca, I'm going to give you the floor. Once again, thank you for everything. I hope that we can continue during this School of Democracy in the years to come. Thank you all for your attention. I'm now we'll pass the floor on to Paul then afterwards, who will give us a great presentation. Luca, you have the floor. Thank you.
Sì, mi scuso, preferivo appunto.
My apologies. I wanted to greet you now, very briefly, because I have other commitments, so I will have to leave later on. First of all, I wanted to welcome all of you to Reggio Emilia, the city of the tricolour, where our flag was born. I want to welcome the Socialists and Democrats from the European Parliament, who have chosen for the fourth time to come here to Reggio Emilia for these important days where we can have political debates and also have some cultural information and training. So I want to thank all of you participants for being here, all of the speakers too, and all of those who will speak after me. I just have a few points that I'd like to share with you. I was asked to contribute on the issue of identity and migration. So I can give you 2 points from a perspective of this city. Just a few minutes ago, I had to leave an important interview with a national newspaper. They're carrying out a survey on the reasons for the progress that the Northern League is having in the Northern Territory of Italy. So that's the main sovereign party of this country. In Reggio Emilia, however, we have 45 communes. The League was at 14%, and in the north it's at 30 or even 35 or 50 or 60% in some cases. But the results have not been winning in any of our communes. So on the issue of identity, I can speak to you about how we have been working in recent years, in the last 10 years, for instance. This city has always had a strong identity, be it territorial or local. Our city has always managed to maintain openness and openness towards the rest of the world. So one of the great dichotomies of our time is the contraposition between open communities and closed communities, between those in favor of Europe and those who are in favor of sovereign models. Well, Reggio Emilia has tried to remain local, but it also has a global and international outlook. I believe that that is one of the key steps of the way in which all reformists in Europe need to have new instruments to deal with modern society. Either we can be convincing in that regard, or gradually we will see ourselves overcome by sovereignist and populist culture. And that's going to just undermine the European ideal. Obviously, I can't say that this is always easy. It hasn't been easy for us. This historic point in time is extremely complicated. We're kind of going upstream here against the grain. But keeping an open mind and a global perspective is something that we have done here. And we also focus on the rights of people, be it citizens' rights, civil rights, human rights. We have led Italian cities to introduce ius soli. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed. We were the first Italian city to celebrate civil union, following the adoption of this by the previous parliament. And we're also a city that is very active in fighting against gender-based violence. Rights is crucial in the political agenda of reformists and Democrats in Europe. And I think that goes alongside another issue that the left find difficult at times: duties, ethics, responsibility, both individual and collective. For instance, as mayor, I can give you an example. If we want recycling at a high percentage, such as 75%, which is what we have achieved here, we're not just talking about the municipality or the commune that has to do that. We also need citizens to be involved. They need to place their rubbish in the right bin. And so we must understand that there is civic duty of participation in an idea of community. And this idea of citizenship and community, that's a strong element that we have worked on in recent years. And then migration. In the last 25 years, this city has gone from 130 to 165,000 inhabitants. It was almost, well, it had almost no migrants. Just 17% were foreign. There were 100 nationalities. So we have had to deal with the issue of intercultural dialogue and interreligious dialogue and literacy for new citizens learning Italian, and also living together and better integration. And I'll be frank, it was difficult. It's never a walk in the park when you're dealing with these type of things, but the community managed to deal with the issue. And I believe that if we've managed to curb the advance of a sovereign culture, of one that undermines the rights of people and that is sometimes xenophobic, then we have succeeded in managing these important points. This city has continued to invest in education. As you know, it's a reference point on the global scale when it comes to the preschools and primary schools. For welfare, we've increased resources, and then health. Richest people in Reggio Emilia go to public hospitals in the same room as poor people. So you can see there, we have made a lot of progress when it comes to health and equality. Talking about my city is something that I'm passionate about, obviously, and I could go on and on until tomorrow morning. But I must acknowledge the work of the people who have come before me. But I must stop now because this evening is devoted to other things. But something I did hear in Spanish, which I think is nice. It's kind of like a breath of fresh air hearing Spanish. I just want to reiterate welcome, and I hope that your work and collaboration, which has gradually developed over the years, will be consolidated over time. And for us, really, it's a reason it's something that's extremely important for our city. Thank you, and all the best with your work.
Right, well, thanks very much for inviting me. I don't know if any of you know who I am. I'm Paul Collier. I'm a professor of economics and public policy. I work mainly on very poor countries. I wrote a book called The Bottom Billion, which some of you might have come across. And then more recently, I've worked on migrants and on refugees. And my latest book, which is just coming out in a couple of months, is about the crisis in our own societies. I don't do optimism and pessimism. I've worked on poor countries for a long time, and the optimists are all dead and the pessimists are all dead. I do realism. And I'm going to try and bring realism to the crisis of social democracy. Wasn't always in crisis. It is now. Why did it get into crisis? I'll come to. But I want first to go back to the pre-crisis period. I was born in the start of the heyday, the great time of social democracy. I was born in 1949. My parents were poor. They both left school when they were 12. I was born in Sheffield, which was about the least fashionable part of Britain. I was born in a National Health hospital 2 years after the National Health had been founded. I went to a very good state school just about 5 years after it had been turned from a private school into a free state school. And then I went from there to Oxford as a student, and it was free. I owe the transformation of my life entirely to that period of social democracy from 1945 to 1970, which transformed my own society and transformed across Europe. The same thing was happening across Europe. And the foundations of that form of social democracy were the cooperative movement. And I'm very proud to be speaking here in this region because this is now the strongest, most powerful cooperative movement in the whole of Europe. But the birth of the cooperative movement was in my part of the world, Northern England, in the 19th century. Why was it born in the north of England in the 19th century? Because the north of England was the first region of the world to industrialize. Peasants came into the cities and faced the hell of early industrialization, the stresses of life in these desperately awful cities which I see again and again in Africa nowadays. And what people did was come together, was forge a common identity born of the crises, the stresses they were facing. And then they built cooperative solutions to those crises, to those stresses that they were facing. And the cooperative movement met the real needs of ordinary working class people, and it met it by building reciprocal obligations. Right? The genius of reciprocal obligations is that every time you create a right, you create an obligation that meets the right. Rights without obligations are just like printing money. Right? It's the moral equivalent of inflation, and that's what we've suffered from in recent years. But the cooperative movement understood that the essence of building a decent society is forge a shared identity and then use the affinity of shared identity to build these reciprocal obligations that transformed, in a very brief period, in 25 years, they transformed our societies and they transformed the opportunities and the lives of people like myself. So that was the heyday of social democracy. What went wrong? Well, two things. One is the economy went wrong, and in consequence, social divisions were opened up. I'm going to talk about that. But there was a third thing that went. There was another thing that went wrong, which was that the philosophical, ethical basis of social democracy got hijacked by a bunch of people who had nothing to do with the cooperative movement, and they've distorted the ethical foundations of social democracy. They've captured it, and we need to recapture it. So, first, what went wrong with the economy? And this started around 1980 and has got worse and worse. And it's two big new divisions that have opened up that didn't happen until around 1980. And one is a spatial division. The new spatial inequalities, new, the last 40 years, are between booming metropolis, Milan, London, Paris, Frankfurt, and broken cities, broken provinces, places like my city, Sheffield, places like Naples. That's the new spatial inequality, the metropolis and the broken provincial cities. Before 1980, that didn't happen. For 100 years before 1980, regional differences have been narrowing. So something changed that's put all that into reverse. That's the new spatial inequality. And when we talk inequalities, it's these two dimensions that are really important. The banks are naughty and we need to do something, but that's not the big story. The big story is spatial, between the metropolis and the broken provinces, and secondly, the new class divisions, which are between the educated and the less educated. The educated are on an escalator of increasing skill and hence increasing earnings. And the less educated are also on an escalator, but it's going in the other direction. Their manual skills are becoming less and less valuable. Their earnings are falling. Their jobs are falling apart. These are the two big new inequalities, the spatial inequality and the skill inequality, the educational inequality. Because of those two economic inequalities, they've been compounded by a further phenomenon, which is a social issue, which is a split in identities. When I grew up, we just come out of the Second World War, there was a huge sense within most of the nations of Europe of shared identity through shared bitter experience, shared struggles. And so, certainly in my environment, everybody I knew identified with the nation, not in an aggressive sense, Britain versus, but just a sense of we're all part of the nation. That was our shared identity. And what's happened more recently, since the 1980s, is that the successful have peeled off from that shared identity. They're denying an identity of belonging to the nation. The people in the metropolis are increasingly seeing themselves as apart from the nation. In America, the phrase to describe the bits between the metropoles is the flyover cities. In London, the famous London commentator who's just come up with the phrase, London being linked to the provinces, it's like being shackled to a corpse. These are insulting phrases that deny shared identity. If you're from a place like Sheffield, you feel that, right? That's the spatial walking away from identity, the successful denying that they have shared interests and responsibilities with the unsuccessful. Right? Milan walking away from southern Italy. And then we get the new class identities. The successful, skilled are increasingly shifting their identity from belonging to the nation to being skilled. They see themselves as in common with other skilled, not with shared national identity. And so what was a shared identity has been shattered by the successful running away. As that happens, the successful are running away from reciprocal obligations. They're denying their obligations to the less successful. The people on the up escalator are denying that they have responsibilities to the people on the down escalator. And that is a disaster. Let me say I feel that very bitterly because, as it happens, I straddle both these cleavages. Right? The spatial cleavage, I grew up in Sheffield. Most of you will know about Sheffield, although you won't know you know, because many of you will have seen the film The Full Monty. That's Sheffield. Right? The Full Monty is a very powerful story of the tragedy of how Sheffield was broken, the steel industry in Sheffield was broken in the early 1980s by the forces of globalization. Right? And that was a massive tragedy for thousands upon thousands of people. And I lived it. My next door neighbor in Sheffield got unemployed. My relatives were forced into jobs cleaning toilets. Meanwhile, I was living in paradise. Right? My postcode in Oxford is the highest ratio of house prices to incomes in the entire country of Britain. Right? And so I'm in prime metropolitan land. Right? But I feel that divide bitterly. And then education, as I say. My parents left school when they were 12, and I've got education coming out of my ears. Right? So I have lived these two divides, the spatial divide and the skill divide. And that's why I care about healing that divide. It's not good enough for the skilled and successful to walk away from those whose lives have been shattered. But now I want to turn to what I consider to be the disasters that have hit the intellectual foundations of social democracy. Yeah? And the foundations that I think are worth returning to are that sense of the cooperative movement addressing the real needs of ordinary working class people and doing so by building reciprocal obligations, rights matched by duties. Yeah? Just to remind you, this was a spectacularly successful thing. It produced cooperative movement in retail, in agriculture, which was here, in housing. You know, one little town in the north of England created the Halifax Building Society. Halifax is a little town in the north of England. And it grew to be the biggest bank in the whole of Britain, one of the biggest in the world, until it was demutualized and then run by the City of London. So the amateur cooperators were ousted, and the whiz kids in the City of London ran it. And it had taken 150 years to grow it from its origins to be the biggest bank in Britain. The City of London took 25 years to bankrupt it. So, why did social democracy depart from the cooperative movement and the principles of reciprocal obligations? It went in three different directions. One, amongst my own profession, economists, we got seduced by utilitarianism and social paternalism. The utilitarian model, which when you think about it is crazy, has it that economists will run the country. Right? We are the Platonic guardians. Plato thought that it would be philosophy professors, but economists put them right, it's economics professors. Right? So we are the vanguard who will maximize global utility. Social paternalism, we know best. Right? Except we didn't. Right? That's why you've had these terrible divisions opening up in the economy since about 1980. So that was the utilitarianism. The classic example of the mess-up is the modernist destruction of cities, which ticked all the boxes of utilitarian utility maximization, except it destroyed communities. The second seduction of social democracy by intellectuals, so the first one was economists running after utilitarianism. The second was lawyers running after Rawlsian victim rights, the idea that there were groups of victims that had to be given special rights unmatched by obligations. And again, that meant non-reciprocal, the move away from reciprocity. And the third intellectual seduction was libertarianism. That wafted in from the United States. The idea that human rights just meant individual rights. Individual rights trumping collective rights. And you see that in vast domains of policy, and it has been a disaster. Right? Human rights don't mean individual rights, because humans are not first and foremost individuals. We are social animals. We are first and foremost members of communities. And so human rights mean privileging the rights of communities against opportunistic individuals who try and exploit things for their own benefit at the expense of the community. Right? We need to re-understand what human rights actually mean and push back against this American libertarian agenda. So, utilitarianism, Rawlsian victim groups, and libertarianism supplanted the cooperative spirit of reciprocal obligations, but none of those three things chimed with the values of ordinary working class people. And so ordinary working class people recognized that, and they walked away from social democracy. And that's why social democracy is in crisis. So what do we do about it? Well, I've got three suggestions. First, we reclaim belonging and identity from the right. It has been terrible that social democracy, which was forged by a sense of community and identity, the shared identity that enabled reciprocal obligations to be built, social democracy, seduced by these utilitarian, Rawlsian, libertarian ideas, walked away from a sense of belonging to a community. People just became individuals with rights. If you walk away from belonging, belonging is one of the fundamental drives that people have. They want to belong to a group. And if we don't respond to that, it just leaves that belonging lying there to be picked up, and look who's picked it up, right? The extremist ideologues. Belonging is too fundamental to what being a human being is about, to leave that sense of belonging to a place, belonging to a group, to the extreme right. So we need to revive a sense of shared identity as being a fundamental part of what it means to be on the left. Because without shared identity, you can't build reciprocal obligations. How do you do that? You do not do it the way the right does, by saying, we belong and you don't. You do it by saying, we all have the same, come from the same place, people belong to the same place, we're all here, and we all have a shared purpose. Place and purpose are to the left what ethnicity or religion are to the right. We share place and we share purpose. So that's my first recommendation, is social democracy needs to rediscover the shared belonging of place and purpose. Secondly, jobs. People need jobs. They don't just need transfers of money, they need to have the dignity and autonomy of earning a living. And so they need a job. That means that jobs have got to move to where people are. At the moment, we've got these crazy policies of trying to move people to where the jobs are. Well, the jobs are in Germany at the moment, right? And so the jobs have got to be moved to where people are. That applies both to, at 4 different levels. Refugees. My latest book, just out in paperback, Refuge, the central recommendation there is that nearly 95% of refugees are not in Europe. Very few refugees came to Europe. Most refugees are in the big regional havens near adjoining conflict. Most refugees are not migrants. Right? I was brought in by the government of Jordan to say, what do we do? 1 million refugees in Jordan. 3 million in Turkey. What do we do? We bring jobs to them. It's entirely feasible. Europe has firms which can create jobs very easily for these people. We take the jobs to the people, not lure the people to the jobs. Exactly the same applies with the poorest countries on earth, the bottom billion, which is 90% of my own work. It is insulting to imagine that the solution to the poverty of poor societies is that their brightest and the best people should come to Europe. What the poorest societies in the world need is our firms to bring proper jobs. And that is the agenda. We need public policy actively and public money to bring jobs to refugees in the havens, to bring work to the poorest societies where they need that work. We need it within countries like Italy. The jobs have got to move from Milan to the south, and we need public policies that ensure that happens, and we need it across Europe. The jobs have got to move from Germany to the southern Europe and Eastern Europe areas where unemployment is absurdly high, especially amongst young people. And firms must be required to do this through tax incentives and so on. We've got lots of public policies that can shift jobs, and we should stop imagining that the solution is to break up communities and shift people. So, belonging and identity through place and purpose, take jobs to people, not people to jobs, And finally, and this is especially for you, train, train, train. Not just the cognitive skills of the cleverer half of the population that goes to university. Most public effort needs to be for the other half of the population, the people who need to develop the non-cognitive skills. And at the moment, big public money is put into the students who are lucky enough to be in the cleverer half of cognitive skills, and the bottom half, the people who are going to have to redeploy from the cognitive skills they learnt at school to picking up the non-cognitive skills, are ignored. It doesn't have to be like that. The model in Europe is actually Switzerland, which has a system where firms put really big money. They pay for half the cost of prolonged periods of 4 years of non-cognitive skills training, and that applies to 60% of the Swiss young population. And so that's the model that we need to do to move public money from the cognitively skilled to the non-cognitive skills. And finally, we need to do that not just amongst young people, but throughout life. Because our economies are sufficiently changing now that people will have to retrain every 10 years or so. There's a new policy just brought in by the French government, which I think is a great policy to be emulated, and that is that everybody is now given a €5,000 credit to be spent on training, which they can spend at any time through their lives. Right? €5,000 isn't enough, but at least it's the principle, it's the right start. Right? If you think about it, the non-cognitively skilled should get at least the same budget, the lifetime budget, as the cognitively skilled who get their education paid for while they're students. And so we equalize that. So there's the three policies, which are all I've got time to recommend: belonging through place and purpose, jobs to people, not people to jobs, and train, both for youth and lifetime, especially a focus on the non-cognitive skills. Now, why I've come, and why I was so excited to come, I did this big fancy event in Brussels in October, 1,400 people. That had its own thrills. But I was more excited to come to you because you are the people who will determine the future. And I believe, other people will disagree with me, I believe that social democracy went wrong in my generation. Your generation has got to put it right. And so it's not enough to say, come and join our club, aren't we doing well? I'd love to be able to say that. But instead, I have to say, come and take over the club, you need to salvage it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for this inspiring intervention, this speech. I share completely your view on the Swiss model. My sister experienced that, and now she has her own small business. And you are right, 60% of the people in Switzerland, they don't go to university, and they can go up to the top of the big companies through this model. I think it's a very good model. I would like to thank also the interpreters, because I know that they are on the movement of strike, but they allow us to have 10 minutes more. Thank you, the interpreters. So we can open the floor for a discussion. After 10 minutes, sorry, but we have to continue in English. and afterwards we will go for the reception to have a drink and to have a nice time. So, who opened the floor? Who wants to make suggestion, to speak, to question? Just one thing, there is no stupid question, there is no stupid comment. The only stupid comment is the comment that you don't dare to put on the table. So, please.
Hi, my name is Johannes, and I've got a question. You mentioned that you suggested to moving jobs. One of your example was like that most of the refugees are next to neighboring countries which they come from. Like, how would you manage to get a company, for example, from Germany, where I'm from, to move the company or the jobs to neighboring country, for example, like Syria or Turkey, or like, because there's so many challenges, like the law system and like the motivation to invest. It's very hard for me to imagine how you would do it, so I would be interested in that. Thank you.
It's a good question. I've got a good answer. All right. First of all, this is what our book recommended. It came out just over a year ago. It's now being implemented very actively. For example, the World Bank created a whole new department. World Bank had done nothing on refugees for 60 years. It's now put $2 billion for the next 3 years to do exactly what we're suggesting. In Jordan, since we started, there are already 80,000 new jobs. Right? Before we started, there were only 4,000 work permits for refugees amongst 1 million. So far, we've already generated 80,000. We only just started. Right? Germany has been creating jobs offshore. Sorry, it's not offshore, but for example, in Turkey, they've been creating hundreds of thousands of jobs in Turkey for years. This is the modern form of globalization. And so it's perfectly possible to make modern globalization work for refugees. Jordan has over 40 industrial zones. We got the idea because we went to visit the biggest refugee camp in Jordan, Zaatari, over 80,000 people there, no work, nothing to do, utterly desolate, right? A complete failure to recognize that what refugees most need is the autonomy of being able to earn a living. And just 10 minutes away from Zaatari was a huge, fully equipped and virtually empty industrial zone. And it had been like that for 4 years, and nobody had actually occurred to them that it was a relatively simple matter to fill that industrial zone up with jobs. Right? So, this is happening already. In fact, it's called the Jordan model. It's now happening big time in Ethiopia for the refugees in Ethiopia, where there's a huge influx of refugees into Ethiopia. And it's now being piloted in Malaysia. So, if we'd been doing this for 20 years, it would now be automatic. Companies, instead of thinking, what should we do to refugees, send some blankets, would think, how can we do our core business in a way that generates jobs? For example, in Britain, I persuaded the then British Prime Minister to take this seriously. He rounded up a load of business leaders, flew them to Jordan, and said, find what you can do in Jordan. And for example, our biggest supermarket chain then ordered a lot of supplies from Jordanian firms, and the deal was for every 100 jobs created, 70 go to refugees, 30 to Jordanians. So this is feasible.
I would continue with the question that was brought up before. How do you see digitalization playing a role in this bringing jobs to the people? Do you see a future where jobs are brought via the internet? to remote areas?
Yeah, so again, it's a good question. How long will industrial jobs be? We've got certainly another 10 years, maybe another 20, and then who knows? We just can't forecast the economic future any beyond that horizon. But yes, what will open up, though, is a lot of service activities, which will become sort of internationally tradable. It's already starting to happen. There's a good way of thinking about the effect of robotics and automation is to think that it will eliminate some tasks, but not necessarily whole jobs. The typical person's job is made up of many different tasks. And some of those tasks are well suited to automation or robots, and others are not. And so you can envisage a time when the robots are doing some of the tasks, and the job then just gets recomposed with the person spending their time doing those tasks which can't readily be automated. And in all jobs, there are actually a lot of those. I should just add that taking jobs to refugees doesn't always mean doing it through globalization. One way of, in Uganda, where Alex Betts, my co-author, has been working a lot, we persuaded the government to reconceptualize refugee camps, not as places where people live in tents and are fed and not allowed to do anything, reconceptualize refugee settlements as temporary cities, which have all the activities of a city. Thank you.
I would like to thank our interpreters, and we agreed 10 minutes, and we'll ask you a big applause for them. And now, Paul, if you agree, we continue in English. You stop when you want.
No.
So, please. There's a lot of questions.
Hello. So my name is Carmen, and first of all, thank you very much for this inspiring speech. I have a question because you mentioned the need of reviving the sense of belonging in a national context, talking about metropolis versus provinces, and talking about this need to strengthen the social democrats. But then there is also the need of strengthening the European identity. And my question is, do you think that those needs are compatible and also in this social democratic context? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I've got a good answer, right? Belonging to place comes in layers. It's like an onion. If you ask yourself, where's home? Home is often literally a house or a flat or something where you grew up, right? And then, so that's the center of the onion, and then you go out and it's a city. It's the city, for me, belonging is the city I grew up in, right? And then beyond the city is the region. I'm a very proud Yorkshireman, and I pass on that identity to my kids, even though they're not living in Yorkshire. And then beyond Yorkshire, I'm English. And beyond English, I'm British. And beyond British, I'm European. Please let us, right? We need to stop the clock on this ridiculous exit. But I live part of the year in North France, in Brittany, and the little town where I live has a series of flags. Every summer, all the flags are there. There's a flag for the town, there's a flag for the département, there's a flag for Brittany, La Bretagne, there's a flag for France, and there's a flag for Europe. And they don't say, oh my God, we've got the flag for Europe up today, we've got to take the flag for Brittany down. Right? These are layers of an onion. And they're not incompatible, on the contrary. You know, if you took the heart out of the onion, it wouldn't be an onion anymore. And so belonging to place is these layers. And we need to get back to that narrative. It's not Europe or, it's Europe and. You know?
Hi, I'm Ana Abdi from Albania. First of all, I would like to thank you for your amazing speech. It was very inspiring, and I think that it tackles all of us because these are the perceptions that we all believe in. I would like to make a question regarding jobs. In my opinion, as much as I've studied until now, I think that we have so many bureaucracies, not only in Europe but globally. We have United Nations that basically has an office about every problem, but there's bureaucracy in there and they don't quite have a solution. So do you think that we can build a platform inside the social and democratic group which can really give solution to jobs? Because I think, and I believe that everyone thinks that the economy, if we boost the economy and if we improve the economic rights, then we can talk and have better individuals which can be better Europeans and better global citizens. Do you think that we need a platform that can, let's say, work on how to move the jobs to the places, not the people to the job?
Yeah, that's the right question. And don't forget, I'm an economist, right? I'm not what I said was not a sort of dreamy aspiration. I believe it's entirely feasible, and there are policy instruments that we can use to do it. We just haven't used them. And we need to. So the little book I've got coming out in beginning of October actually goes into details on this, right? We can move jobs. We need to use public policy to change the incentives for firms. We need to use some public money to get firms to go to places that they don't want to go to because costs would initially be higher. Right? There's a terrible bias that firms, if there's no, in the absence of public policy to the contrary, firms will go to the metropole. And that's why the metropoles are booming, because we haven't got good public policy to counter it. Yeah? I don't know if you followed at all the grim business of Amazon in America announcing that it's going to have a second headquarters. And Amazon is big enough that it could transform the opportunities of a broken city. And Amazon is crooked enough that it knows it's got that power, and so it's going to exploit it to the full by conducting a bidding war amongst American cities. And so broken cities are having to offer vast tax incentives effectively to tax their population to try and lure Amazon to come. There's an article today that says the shortlist for Amazon is going to be dominated by New York and Washington, the two places that just don't need it. Right? And so we need much more active public policy to steer the Amazons of this world to places that need them. Yeah? But we've got those public policies that can be used. We've just not had the nous or the guts to use them. And of course the firms develop their own self-interested narrative that they've got to be in the metropolis. You know? These narratives are false, self-serving, and just have to be countered.
Good evening. My name is Alberto. I'm from Milano, and so you talk about a little bit my city, and I think the situation is very interesting because it's a city where our party, I mean the PD, the Democratic Party, is winning a lot, and that's a problem because Milan is like the city of everybody. Because if you are educated, you can have a job, you can reach your goals. But at the same time, there is a sort of gap between the provinces around Milan and the city. And it's difficult to join in the upper class in Milan because there is a kind of establishment that press everyone under that. So, and another problem related on that is that Renzi made his campaign on the Milano's model. He called it like this. And because he said, okay, if we are thinking Italy like a little country with some success, we can have a left-wing model, very liberal, that can bring job to like a top-down. And so. And I think he failed. I mean, he failed the election, so maybe also this policy was not true. But how can we deal with the idea of internalization compared with, I mean, related with social rights and jobs? Because if in a certain way, like a politician in Italy, they think that that it is really related to our history, like the history of socialism, which is very international. So they compare these two topics in a political solution, but was wrong. So what's your opinion on that?
I apologize. I didn't quite pick up all of that, and I'm not going to ask you to repeat it. But it's not even the case that all the people in a metropolis are doing well. I mean, typically the metropolis, I mean, certainly I've done research on London, and there's a cleavage within the metropolis between the skilled elite that is doing wonderfully and the people at the bottom who are living in very, very overcrowded conditions and desperately competing for accommodation. I can't go into this in any detail, but in the book, there's a big argument that the growth of the agglomeration of the metropolis is generating huge, what's called economic rents of agglomeration. And those rents are not being earned by the skilled, they're being captured by the skilled. Basically, when you bring an awful lot of people together in a city, the city becomes much more productive. And there are two groups who capture those gains. One is the people who own the land values go up, and the other is the skilled people who've got sort of privileged access to the city. And we need to redesign our tax system so that we massively capture those rents of agglomeration for society rather than leaving it to the landowners and the highly skilled. A good model here is what Singapore did. Lee Kuan Yew, who built a really successful society, froze all land values at their 1973 land value, and then proceeded to purchase 2/3 of the land in Singapore for the city at 1973 land prices, because he said the appreciation in land values beyond 1973 is thanks to all of us. It's because we've all been working in Singapore. It's not the people who own the land. They just lay on a beach, right? And so we need to redesign our tax system so that it captures rents rather than captures a tax on effort. And that's, again, entirely feasible to do. And there's big money. The country that's most successful in that, apart from Singapore, is China. They managed to socialize the appreciation in land values. And that's a very important thing for social democrats to wake up to.
Is this better? Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you for your speech. It was very good, very thought-provoking. It actually raised a question in my head. A couple of years ago, as an undergrad, I wrote a speech. Oh, sorry, my name's Amin, I'm from Leicester. A couple of years ago, I wrote an essay on the golden age of social democracy, and I was analysing the reasons for its success and also the reasons for its failures. And among other things, I mean, you probably know this better than I do, but I noted that there were a number of factors such as economic crises, a fragmentation in the left, and sort of the changing class system that contributed to the fall of social democracy and the rise of neoliberalism. My question to you is, given that that took place over 40 years ago and neoliberalism has been here for more than almost 40 years, what's to stop that from continuing in perpetuity?
Yeah, okay, yeah. You've read about it, I lived through it. But you're quite right. The actual details of economic policy that worked 1945 to 70 gradually sort of fell apart through the 70s. And that provided an opportunity for the false but seductive mantra of the American right, which was that the free market was the solution and you just needed to deregulate. We learnt the hard way that that wasn't right. Right? But your central point that the economic policies of social democracy that worked in the 60s and 50s gradually deteriorated in the 70s, and that's right. And so, whilst I want us to go back to the philosophical basis of social democracy in that period, 1945 to 70, which was reciprocal obligations, shared identity, cooperative movement, I don't want us to just literally return to the economic policies of that time. The big economic cleavages that have opened up in the last 40 years, this spatial divide and this skill divide, were not happening 1945 to 70. And so we didn't have policies that are equipped to tackle those problems. We need new policies that will tackle them. We also got into a complete mess over inflation. And so we need policies which avoid that peril without the sort of drastic fiscal solutions, which are not solutions. They produced mass unemployment across Europe. And so it's not literally return to the economic policies in detail of 1945 to 70, but there are social democrat policies, economic policies, which would solve the anxieties of the present, which are different from the anxieties that social democracy 1945 to 70 solved. I'm a pragmatist. Ideologues believe that there's one answer which is right forever. And the world is not like that. Right? Ideologues are dangerous idiots, in my view. Right? The world keeps changing the problems, and that's why we need to combine the head and the heart with pragmatic solutions that address today's problems. Right? We can't address today's problems with yesterday's ideologies.
Hi, Paul. Fionn McGarry is my name. I have been living in Ireland for the last 9 years, having grown up in Australia. It's a pleasure to hear you speak. You're the most read man on the politics syllabus in Trinity in Dublin. And what you were saying about the division between the metropolis and I suppose more rural areas really resonates in the light of our recent abortion referendum, where the only county that voted no was Donegal, which would most likely have voted yes if all of the young people had not been living in Dublin, Cork or Galway. But I suppose my main question, though, is at what point do preferential policies relating to economic development and jobs become a race to the bottom? I think in Ireland it's really noticeable that our corporate tax rate is 12.5%, but companies like Google, Apple, Facebook and Amazon pay closer to 1%. And we had this really quite ignominious situation a couple of years ago where our government refused €13 billion in taxes in order from Apple when we have underfunded public services, underfunded education, underfunded everything else. You know, at what point does that become a race to the bottom?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we've got to avoid that race to the bottom. You know, we've had a race to the bottom in corporate taxation. What Amazon's trying to do in America at the moment is have a race to the bottom amongst American cities, offering it the sweetest deal. And so we've got to avoid that sort of structure. It doesn't work. Right? We need much more proactive approaches. Ireland's a model here of how to get stuff to places that initially don't have jobs. Because the Irish Investment Authority, from the 1950s onwards, developed a whole new approach, which was target firms that you think could be viable, find out what they need, try and coordinate a group of firms to come to the same place, and then follow the firm once it's there to see whether it can expand. And most of Ireland's jobs from new investment came as follow-ups to the initial investment. Right? So the Irish model of using an investment authority is really quite an intelligent model. But a related approach is that take a broken city like Sheffield after this collapse of the steel industry. Now, Sheffield has two very good universities, and it has a skilled population. And so there was a potential to say, we're going to create a new hub. We're not going to try and revive the old, but we're going to try and attract new firms in, and we'll find out where are those firms. There'll be a coordinated attempt to build industrial clusters of coordination problems. And so you've got to try and get a group of firms to come together. You can only do that with active public policy. The market will not do it. What the market does with broken cities is fill them up with junk jobs like warehouses and the sort of low-skill stuff. And so the market really does not work. What I'm saying here is not just me. on the economic geography of cities, I've been pairing up with Tony Venables, who's one of the top 2 or 3 economic geographers in the world, and he's got a whole block of analysis on why the market doesn't work to revive broken cities and how you can do it. So there are solutions here. You know, they're not solutions of 2 minutes. They're serious people who've got to use a coordinated effort of linking training with universities and with firms to try and coordinate a whole package. And that will cost money. It's worth it. This young lady there.
Good evening. My name is Mateusz. I'm from Warsaw, from Poland, from a party called Razem. We are not members of SND, but I would like to thank you for your hospitality. It's really great to be here. I'm pretty excited. I have plenty of thoughts regarding very inspirational speeches. Thank you for that. I would like to ask you how the left-wing Social Democratic Party should behave in the land of prosperity, because you mentioned our country, and of course like a threat for democracy and the rules of law is something we of course face, but we also face a prosperity. Actually, the Law and Justice government, they've done all these things you mentioned. So they captured the identity, they secure people jobs in a way that they establish universal child benefit, and they established for the first time ever in Poland, they established the minimum the wage for an hour, and they train themselves. I mean, they don't really make the mistakes that the previous government's done a lot, or they have enough strong fan base to kind of cover that. So my question is how the left-wing party should behave in opposition in a land of prosperity. And my second question is, if I may ask, because I can't mention that, there is a 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birthday this year, and there is a huge celebration around that. From my perspective of a country that is way more neoliberal than the Western Europe, that has way more weaker public services than Western Europe, that has way bigger social injustice. I don't think that the social dialogue is happening. I see the reality around me more like a class war, which is a class war of the rich against the poor, against the people. And I just wonder, like, maybe it's time to rethink the social democracy view on that issue. Maybe we should put stronger the agenda of showing how the neoliberal system is working against the people, and how the rich people are completely out from the society. I was really shocked when I heard the report from Oxfam that 8 richest persons in the world are owning more than the bottom half of our planet's citizens. So these 2 issues for you. Thank you. And congratulations for Spain. I mean, we were really supporting that takeover too, and good luck.
Yeah. First of all, populism doesn't have answers. It has answers that work for 10 minutes. Dealing properly with the economic divides requires really rather clever policies. You've got to use the head as well as the heart. Populism is just using the heart. And so, It works as long as it works, and then it doesn't. And then you plunge into crisis. The inequality stories, I've not, just in the interest of time, I haven't talked about what went wrong in firms, but let me just spend a couple of minutes on that. Firms have not always been as unethical as they are now. And the damage came from the American far right, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman wrote to the New York Times in a famous letter in 1970 saying the only purpose of a firm is to make profits for shareholders. And that mantra gradually filtered through into business schools, which then taught it, and then that gradually filtered up the hierarchy of management, which then lived it. So by the 1990s, across a lot of firms in Europe and America, management thought what it ought to do was maximize shareholder value and nothing else. In the process, shareholdings were then controlled by hedge funds, pension funds, insurance companies, which decided the best thing to do if a company wasn't performing was sell it. And so their criteria became quarterly profits. That meant that the chief executive of a company desperately needed to keep quarterly profits rising. And you could only do that for a short time. The typical tenure of a chief executive in big companies is currently 4 years. And they deploy one of a very limited range of strategies. So one is you cut expenditures of things that won't pay back beyond until after 4 years. Right? So you cut investment. And we find that publicly quoted companies, this is the British data, but publicly quoted companies in Britain invest 2.7% of revenues, whereas privately held companies, where shares are not on the market, invest an average of 9% of revenues. So there's a massive reduction in investment. And secondly, you cheat. You're probably young enough to think that accountancy is a rigorous profession where it's clear what is profit and what isn't. It ain't, right? There's a very grey area, and so the easiest thing for chief executives to do is declare a profit which is fictional, and we've seen that, right? So this is what companies started to do. Because chief executives were under such pressure and only there for 4 years, they started paying themselves much better. So for example, in America, if we go back to 1970, the gap between the chief executive and the average for the company was 20 to 1. It's now, I think, 230 to 1. But there's no improvement in the performance of companies. Banks are a slightly different story. There, the ratio has gone to 500 to 1. Right? These are insulting and dysfunctional inequalities because just as with societies that need to build shared identity and shared obligations, so within a firm, a proper firm does exactly that. It builds shared identity across the workforce and a shared sense of purpose and common obligations. Just to finish this story, when I grew up, the most admired company in Britain was ICI, imperial chemical industries. It aimed to be the best chemical company in the world, and young people like me, if they were doing science, that's what they really aspired, to get a job with imperial chemical industries, so that you could really produce these great, this work with this great company. And then in the 1990s, the senior management of ICI got the mantra, we're aiming to maximize shareholder value. So they changed their mission statement. Instead of we aim to be the best chemical company in the world, we aim to maximize shareholder value. Nobody ever got up in the morning to maximize shareholder value, and the workforce at ICI certainly didn't. And so profits actually started to tank. So instead of shareholder value going up, it went down, and ICI, none of you will have heard of it because it no longer exists. Right? So that move to shareholder value, which had its origins in that letter from Milton Friedman, has proved disastrous. It's been a machine both to make companies less functional, less purposive, and to get these grotesque inequalities between the senior staff and ordinary workers.
Hello. I have a question regarding one of the solutions you have proposed for the reinstitutionalization of social democracy, which is to give a place and a purpose to people instead of, for example, an ethnicity and a religion. I would like to know your thoughts on, for example, ironically, Brexit, where, for example, it could be said that people found a place and a purpose together, but what we think was not the right one, or even more the opposite example with Catalonia more recently, where equally people found a place and a purpose altogether, but we could say that we'd support more, for example, that type of resolution. So what are the differences, and how can we find solutions?
No, it's very, very good. So we need to have an inclusive belonging, not an exclusive belonging, right? And place, the example of Catalonia is a good example of where that was an exclusionary use of place, because, as it were, the row of flags stopped at Catalonia instead of having the flag of Spain and the flag of Europe, Now, if you look at these secessionist movements around the world, which I've done, in Britain it's Scotland wants to secede, in Spain it's Catalonia, in Yugoslavia the first one was Slovenia, Nigeria, believe it or not, Biafra's back, wanting to secede, and the latest is in Brazil, the regions around Sao Paulo want to secede. All these secessions have one thing in common. They are the richest region in the country wanting to break away. What is the Northern League if it isn't saying we don't want to pay for the South? These secessions, which masquerade as we want to be comradely, build community. That's the masquerading narrative of the Scottish Nationalist Party. And it's a scam. They're not sharing, wanting to be equal. The only reason they're not revealed as greedy opportunists is because their public relations departments have done a good job and not been challenged by the likes of us. Right? These are disgraceful secessionary movements which are manifestations of greed, every single one of them. Now, Brexit was something else. Brexit wasn't the greedy wanting to run off. It was the neglected saying, help. And Brexit happened because they had been neglected and ignored. And so by foolish policies between 1980 and 2016, we reaped this whirlwind of people using that opportunity as a protest. It wasn't a thought-through strategy of, we want this set of policies. It was the one opportunity people had to throw a spanner in the works of what the elite had been doing. And they took that opportunity. And it's a tragedy, because, of course, the very people who voted for Brexit were the ones who are most hurt. The elites will protect themselves very nicely, thank you. So it's a tragedy, and yes, if possible, we need to stop it. There is the window of hope. The real window of hope is not second referendum and all that stuff, which would be nice, but won't. The real window of hope is just to agree on one thing and one thing only, and that is that we stop the clock. For the next few years, I would like to see Britain as being, in effect, the sort of the equivalent of Turkey. Turkey, you'll have noticed, is in process of joining the European Union and always will be. And for the next few years, it would be great if Britain was in the process of leaving the European Union and always will be. That's the best practical reason. Nobody will like it, but it's the one thing that's just about politically feasible. Thank you.
Dear Paul, as you see, there are very proactive young people asking questions. If we continue, we'll go for Spanish time for dinner. For me, it's okay. But I think for you, British, no. Seriously, I think that we will be together in the reception now, and you can ask questions and have a talk with Paul. Thank you very much, but we have also to respect the people who prepare the dinner. So, thank you very much. Enjoy the reception, enjoy the evening, the night, but please, tomorrow at 9 sharp here. Thank you.